Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. We hope you and your family are safe, sheltering in place in a comfortable environment, and we look forward to greeting you back at the Yacht Club just as soon as this COVID-19 pandemic is past us. Our speakers today, two of them, have a great and very fun story to tell. First of them, Greg Viggiano was born in Yonkers, learned to sail on a 18-foot Hobie Cat as an 18-year-old. He got his MA in telecom at Michigan State, went on to earn a PhD in mass communication at Florida State. Remembers flying a hull in his Hobie 16. Those of you who've flown hulls in Hobie 16s know it's just the most thrilling thing you can do before flipping your Hobie 16. Something that'll even be brighter in your memory if you're at all like me, because it's pretty bright in the memory the first time I flipped Hobie 16. But it's a thrilling way for people to be learning about sailing. His co-speaker today, Jerry Vanek, was born in Czechoslovakia, and at 10 years of age remembers whale watching off of Salem, Massachusetts, where his family had moved, and they lived in New England. He got his architecture degree in Syracuse, and he's currently an avid kayaker and can tell lots of stories about doing amazing things in kayaks, including, this is the first ever I've heard of someone going aground in a kayak. He's got lots of incredible, successful things, so I have to congratulate him for admitting going around in a kayak because I've only flipped them embarrassingly myself. He's in the cultural studio at Smith Group and the lead architect at the Museum of Science Fiction. Quite an exciting and ambitious project. We're anxious to hear all about it, including thoughts on a sailing museum, but a Museum of Science Fiction is an exciting thing for Greg and Jerry to be working on. So Greg Viggiano and Jerry Vanek, welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thank you for that introduction.
Pleasure to be here. We got the museum started in 2013 as a concept, and we've been doing a lot of interesting programming type work as we raise awareness and raise funding to put hopefully a physical museum in the DC area, hopefully in the near future. What we'd like to do today is go through some ideas that we've come up with on how museums may be able to operate in a pandemic type environment. Right now, the current COVID-19 pandemic has brought a lot of things to a standstill, including the arts and cultural type organizations and museums. So Jerry and I got talking a few months ago about ways that museums might be able to still operate in this type of environment.
As Greg said, we're going to talk about the post-COVID museum design.
And what we'd like to talk about in some detail is how museums have shifted focus in the current situation. What has been the obvious and not so obvious impact of COVID-19, and the ways in which museums are adapting to this new operating environment, and some of the things that they've done to rethink and reimagine the exhibits and the ways that visitors experience the whole museum environment. Then we've got some ideas on a post-COVID museum of science fiction, and in turn, how a sailing museum could implement some of those same ideas.
All right, so as a museum designer, I'm interested in, obviously, in the way that COVID has impacted museums. And so this first image is a quick background on museums. Traditionally, museums were places that housed artifacts behind glass. There wasn't much interactivity. But in the past few decades, museums became more and more interactive, and they have begun offering other programs, other activities. Some of those are listed here. They shifted focus to things like venue rentals, weddings, hosting weddings, parties, seminars. Most museums now have restaurants, theaters, gift shops, obviously. And all of these sort of amenities are more susceptible to, being closed because of COVID. Museum closures and social distancing have obviously impacted museums more because of those amenities that they offered to in order to bring more visitors into the museum and be more financially stable. Obviously, the social distancing measures have prevented museums from being fully occupied at any one time, and reducing visitor density in the museum has obviously a negative impact on how much money the museum can bring in. So that's really been devastating for a museum's ability to operate. And the real sort of tragedy in all of this is that the museums who were actually had a financially successful model, who were able to bring in money through ticket sales and all of these other events, were impacted more through the closures, as opposed to the museums who were less financially successful and relied more on donations and grants. So that's been the real tragedy here. So for me as a museum designer, and for Greg as a museum operator, the question is, will COVID have, is it just a short-term change that we have to adjust to, that we then go back to the previous normal, or is this now, will COVID have a lasting impact on how museums operate and how museums are designed? So some of those short-term changes that I talked about include museums right now, in order to reopen, they're limiting the number of visitors that they allow in. Obviously, they're anticipating social distancing. They're requiring visitors to wear masks. They've set up one-way traffic lanes. They've identified pinch points where people gather, so like in front of bathrooms, and they've set up larger queuing areas for those. They've closed down restaurants and are offering grab and goes and packaged foods. So those are all sort of short-term changes that will presumably might go away once we're out of the pandemic. But Greg and I think that we're in a different environment now, that the pandemic isn't an isolated incident that will just go away. We think that health crises like this are more likely to occur now because of things like increase in urban density, more international travel, and a lot of firms are becoming more global. My office, for example, Smith Group, has an office in China. When the pandemic sort of hit, everyone flew back who was abroad and had to quarantine themselves. This is much more likely. This is a much sort of the newer way of operating in this global economy that wasn't around, maybe 30 or 40 years ago. So we're thinking about it differently. Also, the pandemic, contagious diseases themselves have been around forever. And we sometimes forget that the seasonal flu impacts a lot of people. I think 50,000 people are affected by it every year. And diseases that have once were thought to have been on the decline are now coming back. Things like measles, because of anti-vaccination efforts. These diseases are coming back, and they affect places where people gather, basically. Theme parks, this is where the outbreaks happen. So museums are susceptible to those sort of contagions and diseases spreading. So we're kind of asking ourselves, what responsibility do we have as museum operators and designers in preventing these diseases from spreading and affecting visitors and creating an unsafe environment? The questions that have been coming up is, how does all of this impact museum design? And what would a post-COVID museum look like. So some of the ideas that we had is there would be a shift from touch to gesture interactives. The image on the bottom is from the Gallery 1 from the Cleveland Art Museum. It shows a visitor interacting with a camera. The camera translates her image and then puts it up on the screen. And this is certainly a safer way to interact with an exhibit versus touching things, touching shared interactives. The image above shows an app being loaded onto a tablet, as opposed to picking up a flyer or something. If you walk into a museum, you have a personal device, a phone, and you download an app, and then that lets you navigate through the museum. It offers information about various artifacts. And then thirdly, disposable devices might be much more common. I mentioned Google Cardboard specifically. Google Cardboard is it's a piece of it's a packaged cardboard product that you unfold and have a sort of a visor that you then take your phone, a preloaded app on that phone slips into that visor, and you put it on your head, and it's almost like a virtual reality rig, and you can walk around the museum with this, and it gives you can give you a more enhanced visitor experience, sort of a richer experience. And so this is a shot of that virtual reality experience, and you can put this device on, and it lets you navigate from one artifact to another without actually moving through the museum. And I think this might be prevalent in a situation like, I'm thinking of like the Louvre, where so many people go see the Mona Lisa, and you might be in a very crowded room, and you might have to wait there for an hour just to get up close to the painting. Well, this device will let you stand in a corner of the room by yourself, sort of away from other people, not by yourself, but in a safe distance, and then you can virtually zoom into the painting, zoom in, you look at details, zoom around the painting, and it gives you more information about it. And it's just a richer, enhanced experience that's much safer than sort of getting close to it in a group of people. So I think this could be the future of museums.
So what we were thinking, how to design a museum in the midst of a pandemic is to keep as much as we can from the traditional museum experience, where we'd highlight future innovation and give some sort of space to meeting, socializing, connecting, and retain the educational aspects of the traditional STEM areas, but adding the arts to create STEAM. And then showing how we can create connections between science and science fiction, and going from imagination to reality. And I think one of the main aspects is underscoring the cultural significance of science fiction and its impact on humanity. But now, going a step further, how do we keep a museum operating in the midst of a pandemic? We kind of started to think about what's able to be done outside, in the form of whether it be a marina or whether it be a sculpture garden, and bring the community into open space and still give them socially distant, safe spaces to move about, with still keeping the theme around science fiction, art, and technology. So the main value proposition remains the same, and the museum's mission is to create a center of gravity where art and science are powered by imagination, and show how science fiction and science continually inspire individuals, influence cultures, and impact societies. You can easily take the types of exhibitions and display objects and put them outside in open areas, for the most part, and where things were locked up inside, they can be brought outside. And special purpose display cases can be built to maintain the critical environmental conditions. If we can put a soda machine in the desert and serve ice cold Coke or Pepsi, there's no reason why we don't have the technology to maintain these types of fragile artifacts in these types of conditions. The tricky part is to maintain the educational aspects that we need to keep intact and woven into the museum exhibits and visitor experiences. So this is an example of a full-size space vehicle that is open air and installed on an airport side runway. Even though it's been photo manipulated, so it's not actually a real vehicle, it conveys the point pretty well of how these things could be constructed and still give visitors some really thrilling types of experiences to see by coming to this big open air type museum. So what aspects are there in an open air museum of science fiction? Well, like you just saw, we have large scale outdoor display objects and other types of ground installations. Some of these objects are so big, you can easily see them from space via Google Earth. It's kind of similar to what we see in Washington with the National Air and Space Museum. Either location, both on the mall and at the Dulles facility, have actual size space vehicles and aircraft. If they were moved outside, of course they would be visible from Google Earth. And you can check by just seeing at any major metropolitan airport how big the planes can be seen as viewed from space. Also, adding to that, we can put a full suite of immersive augmented reality and virtual reality overlays, technology overlays, like Jerry explained before, being in the Louvre in virtual reality and having the room to yourself and getting very close to something like the Mona Lisa. Mixed reality is also very interesting, where you can basically put other things into the space that may not be there because of expense, or it's just too complex to actually have something installed in reality as opposed to virtual reality or mixed reality. Strategically, some of these exhibits are going to be well suited for all weather type environments, such as snow, and retail kiosks likewise can be built for all weather type operation, moving away from the traditional museum gift store to multi-location type vending machines. The day-to-day maintenance is fairly low compared to an indoor facility, and some of these things can be rapidly designed if the land area is available in a year to a year and a half. Here's an example of a Millennium Falcon replica that actually was installed in a photo manipulated image in the foundation of a building that was going up. So that gives you some idea of what can be done both in reality or in a mediated reality like virtual reality or augmented reality. So as we were thinking about how we would go about designing a museum of science fiction, a lot of the things lend themselves pretty nicely to a sailing museum or a maritime museum concept. And the picture you see here is the Maritime Museum in Kobe, Japan, and it features large scale outdoor display objects, and they can be put right next to existing harbors or marinas. Likewise, augmented reality and virtual reality can equally play a role in some of the educational aspects that are going to be tried to be conveyed to show various concepts involved in maritime and sailing operations. And of course, like what we were just talking about, they need to be done in all built for all weather type environments. The next slide is another outdoor maritime area in Australia. This is the National Maritime Museum in Sydney, I believe, and that is I think a British submarine that was operated by the Australian Navy and on display at their maritime museum.
Great, thanks very much. Got a few questions for you. So tell me the milestones between having this vision now and opening the museum. What are the milestones you envision?
Jerry, why don't you take that one? Because you've done so much of the design work. I think it just comes down to how to get it funded.
I mean, in any museum project, the two biggest obstacles are, as Greg mentioned, funding and finding a site, especially if we're here in Washington, D.C., where real estate is so competitive. So I think those are our two biggest challenges right now.
So funding, what do you visualize for funding? What's your first funding model look like? How much?
Well, I think on a more modest end of the scale, that would be a smaller facility, almost like a visitor center. Even something with 5,000 to 10,000 square feet would most likely be in the $10 to $15 million range.
And source of funding, how corporate, how individual are you imagining your funding pool or potential? Where do you think you're going to get the money?
Well, I think it would be from a range of different sources. I think large net worth individuals would be a key part. A lot of general public support would also be involved, and also some corporate funding from organizations that may be interested in sponsoring certain types of exhibits, because it aligns well with the type of businesses they're running.
Talk to us about the way you visualize this. Let's imagine that we start out with the smaller exhibit space. You're talking 5,000 or so square feet. You walk in, then would you have an augmented reality device? You use your smartphone to look at exhibits, or are you visualizing them being on video walls? Or what's the presentation technology that you're imagining?
Well, I think there's two answers to that question, Ron, because now that we're in a pandemic, I think it may not make sense, or it may not make as much sense anymore to have a box that you walk into in the form of a building. Whereas a sculpture garden type approach, where you're basically going to be setting up display objects in a big open area, say maybe half the size of a football field, and if you have access to that site, you probably don't even need to try to own it. You could lease it on a relatively short term, but building the display objects and then storing the display objects when they're not in use would be the key aspect there. And I think something like that could be done for a fraction of what it would take to build a traditional type museum, albeit on a smaller scale, like 5 to 10,000 square feet.
Is there some beginning of when we'd say, gee, the first sci-fi happened when? I mean, you know, obviously we all know about Jules Verne and so on, but were there earlier examples? You know, obviously the mythology of the early Greeks would, you know, might fit as what would be sci-fi for that time. But I'm wondering, is there if you were looking at a history of sci-fi, where would anybody talk about the beginning of it?
Well, I mean, Da Vinci's inventions could be considered sci-fi. Flying machines and submarines. You can look back at what Da Vinci was doing. I mean, for me, maybe sci-fi could have been more of a start with Mary Shelley and Frankenstein in the early part of the 1800s. I think it was 1818, and that's literature. Film is another set of dates that it depends on how you want to bring an exhibit together. But how you would go about putting an exhibit together to highlight Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, the creature, and bring that outdoors would kind of be a bit of a challenge because unless the creature is made out of bronze, the traditional types of fabric that you would use in the costume part of it and how you would create the anatomy could be not compatible with weather conditions and making it safe for viewers to see on a continuous basis.
And if I can add to what Greg just said, I think for me, science fiction, like the real science-based science fiction, starts with H.G. Wells, where he was really interested in science, and especially the newer concepts like evolution, and it translated into his stories. War of the Worlds is where you know, basically these aliens come to Earth and then are themselves defeated by the viruses to which humans have become that they've evolved with and are not as susceptible to. And it's really taking that kind of scientific approach and thinking about fiction and literature and how all of those things could marry. I think H.G. Wells was really the central figure behind that.
Yeah, Jerry is absolutely right, especially with the Martian war machines would make a fabulous outdoor display grouping.
So because we're in this pandemic, lots of things are now online. What about the concept that you would have a purely online museum? Is that something that you've considered? In other words, I don't like the idea, but we've got to be asking about it. Right now, we're not in a meeting. We're in different cities, 3 different cities, and we're having a conference. We're having a conversation. When I start thinking about big video walls, I wonder, well, what if the first version of a museum would be a purely online version of a museum? What's the difference between that and a movie of a museum? So,
yeah, I think there's still, even though some of the slides that we shows these sort of immersive virtual reality environments that anybody can access with their computer, I think there's still a desire for people to be outside and to go do something, not be cooped up in their homes. So I think there's still, you know, some need for social interaction. Even though you're 6 feet away from somebody, you're still there in that place talking to someone. So I think it's not a full replacement. We're not going to be doing a fully virtual museum. I think there's still a place that people want to gather, and the virtual reality sort of becomes a tool that enhances the experience. It doesn't replace it. I think that's the way we're thinking about it.
So when you compare books to web pages, one of the benefits of a web page is you can use hyperlinks to provide a more immersive or detailed experience if you want. And I'm hearing you say that in your museum, you could have augmented reality or virtual reality, which could provide more detail sort of at the push of a button when the viewer wants that more detail. Otherwise, they could stay at a more cursory view of the museum. Talk to me about the potential then of immediacy. Can't you change the themes or subjects or exhibits of the museum to have more immediacy to the exhibits? If there's a key theme that comes up, and what if you decide to show a sci-fi theme that, you know, you don't have to build a whole set to create?
I think that's pretty easy to do in a mediated environment, Ron. I think moving to virtual reality and picking up something that's happening currently right now, like the pandemic, and looking at how pandemics have been highlighted in science fiction, like Crichton's Andromeda Strain, and that film from the late 1960s, I think it was. You know, is incredibly current, and that would be easy to do in virtual reality. I actually met with a company last week or the week before last, and they are in the process of building a museum of science fiction that they demoed to me, and I got to wear an Oculus Quest virtual reality headset and toured the museum they built for the Museum of Science Fiction, which was pretty impressive. Now, it's still not as photorealistic as you would see in a video game, or some video games, but it was still incredible, and it was done in a way where the three of us, you in San Francisco and me and Jerry in DC, could meet in the same space and see each other and communicate, just like we're doing on Zoom right now, but with avatars and virtual reality visors. So to answer your question before, that is probably something that we're going to continue to explore, because we can do that along with other types of museum of building and sculpture garden and that sort of thing. So it's not just going to be virtual reality or online or a bricks and mortar museum and a sculpture garden. It could be a combination of all of those things.
Yeah, revealing my days at Electronic Arts, we on the senior team constantly were thinking of gamification of any and every experience. And ever since I learned about your Museum of Science Fiction, I kept thinking about all the ways that people can gamify the museum experience. And just what you're talking about, you actually can have an avatar and visit the museum as an avatar, and visit it as if you were from Mars, and you visit it as if you had less gravity. So the opportunities for the type of exhibits and the experience with the Museum of Science Fiction are fun and quite imaginative. So talk to me, how does sci-fi change the world?
Well, that's a big question. Jerry, you better take that one.
I think we're all for me, and I don't know if I can speak for Greg as well. We were inspired by Gene Roddenberry's vision, sort of a better future, and how we could get there through science and cooperation. And so I think that's science fiction dreams big in that way, to imagine this sort of a better world where we could all live.
Science fiction has always done a great job of exposing topics that need exploration and discussion. And it's funny how certain topics are just not very comfortable to talk about, yet if they're put in a science fiction context, it kind of conveys the same message, like the first interracial kiss on Star Trek in the late 1960s, and how that was they had some episodes that were talking about a lot of the racial unrest that was going on in the 60s, and today it's back, and we're looking at science fiction almost to be a teacher, and to be able to approach subjects in a way that might not be as confrontational, and maybe come up with some alternatives or solutions to correct what needs to be corrected.
It's sad to acknowledge, but there are many more dystopian views of the future that people pay money to go watch in movies than utopian visions of the future. Are you going to be at all dystopian in your themes and/or exhibits that you can imagine?
Well, I think I'll answer the question first, and then I'll pass it over to Jerry. You know, as a museum, we can highlight lots of different types of future depictions, and dystopian stories are usually warnings about to try to avoid certain types of things, like, you know, climate change. This is what's going to happen if you don't make corrections, or what we're going through with the pandemic right now. The Andromeda strain luckily had a happy ending, but artificial intelligence in the Terminator, not such a happy ending. But those are things that can help us avoid certain futures that may give us more things to think about before we just proceed blindly into the night. But yeah, to answer your question, I think it's important to highlight a more optimistic view of the future, because some of these things could be self-fulfilling prophecies, and if we don't balance it, I think that could create a little bit of a problem. And I think also as a museum, we owe it to the visitors to present things in an equal and balanced and even representation. Jerry?
Yeah, I think Greg is exactly right. As the dystopian science fiction sort of shows you the kind of world you want to avoid living in, and it's sort of a warning. If you're headed down that path, you might end up here. You know, I'm thinking of authors like Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale or 1984. These are all sort of social commentaries on if we're not careful, this is where society might end up. So I think behind all of these is a positive message. Yeah.
So what do you expect your carbon footprint to be?
Well, if it's a sculpture garden, it's going to be 0.
Yeah.
Jerry, you were going to respond to that?
Exactly. If it's some sort of an outdoor a museum experience, there's no, maybe outdoor lighting, but all of this could be powered by photo cells. So there's no mechanical systems, there's no air systems. It would be a very light carbon footprint.
What about humor? Have you thought about humor in sci-fi at the Sci-Fi Museum? I was thinking about it, and I don't see much humor in sci-fi. I can't remember humorous things, even though I love humor. We're laughing about it right now, and sci-fi is the future. It's an imagined future. So what about
I think there's comic relief in different stories and in different films, different TV shows, but it's in very small quantities. You do have your Galaxy Quest, which is much more of a comedy, but then you have certain things like in the original Star Trek series, they used to have sometimes funny pieces within the episode, and it was effective. But I think with science fiction, it's not really designed to be a comedy or have a strong continuous stream of funny stories. I mean, when they're done and they're done effectively, they're terrific. But I don't think it's a genre that easily lends itself to a lot of comedy. But then again, you know, you have Hitchhiker's Guide, and that was another comedy that was really good. But in terms of the statistics, there's not a lot of really funny stories out there in science fiction. What I think what authors do, or what script writers do, is they put in funny pieces just to break up the tension in the story, and some of that is incredibly effective.
I was just going to say that one of my favorite shows right now is Seth MacFarlane's The Orville, and that's a comedy, and it's a very funny show. So it's not like that there really isn't a lack of comedy in science fiction. I think you just have to look for it. It's not like science fiction authors have a no sense of humor.
How many exhibits are you imagining you'd open with?
Oh, well, it depends on what you're talking about as we open. I mean, if it's a sculpture garden in a football field or half a football field, it could be a couple of dozen. If it's a virtual reality, it could be a couple of dozen galleries filled with things. There wouldn't be any limit with a virtual reality museum. If it was a bricks and mortar type museum, then that really is driven by cost. And to give you an idea of, to build a 50,000 square foot museum would probably be about $200 million. And I think then you would have to start to figure out how to fill it up. And depending on how you fill it up, could be many times more than that.
So number of exhibits in any one of these models. Are you talking initially 7, 10, some number of exhibits that you visualized early in?
Well, you know, for a curator to answer that question, we'd have to start with what we're going to, what kind of exhibit we're going to do. And if it's going to be costuming and the subject is going to be Star Wars or a type of spacesuit type survey, it would be completely dependent on that, Ron.
I think it also depends on what story we want to tell and have the story drive the exhibits.
Yeah, so what is the overall story?
That changes too. I think there's lots of different stories about science fiction. It comes down to what aspect of a particular thread of science fiction you want to explore, and it might not be all spaceships and aliens. It could be costuming. It could be weapons. It could be medical devices. It really depends on the curatorial approach, and that changes too, because in order to create a space and a place that visitors are going to want to return to, these exhibits will be changed out on a pretty regular basis, probably on an annual basis, which is done a lot easier in virtual reality.
So it's fun for our viewers to be listening to an entrepreneur and architect at the beginning, early embryonic phase of such a development as the Museum of Science Fiction. And I recognize that in your answers, you're hypothesizing what you think can happen, and that's part of the game. We out here in the West Coast are pretty familiar with startups. We get that you can keep pivoting as you see success in one or more areas. How long at this point are you imagining a visitor would want to be in the Museum of Science Fiction? What's an average visit length? Have you thought about that?
Well, it depends on the size, obviously, of the museum, how many exhibits we have, how many storylines we have, but it could be anywhere from half an hour to an hour.
Initial exhibit ideas? Have you started with a couple of thumbnail ideas about we want an exhibit on this subject, that subject, another subject? Can you reveal any of those?
We've gone through several exercises on what we want to show. There's a focus, I think, on education, especially, and the concept of STEAM that Greg talked about. So I think that's a sort of central driver, how we can use science fiction to talk about all of these math and science concepts in a more engaging way for kids. So I think that's
when we drew up the plan for the full-size museum, we had 7 different types of galleries. So we tried to come up with a taxonomy of how we'd organize and then populate those galleries with different objects and exhibits. And there were, of course, vehicles and aliens, time travel, technology, computers and AI. Most everything would fit into those 7 categories. Oh, one was creators with the authors, and then there was a last one that may come to me. But the way we were thinking of how to organize science fiction and the content and put everything into those types of physical galleries and categories, we probably start that way, and then within that we can look at lots of other ways to cross-cut it, make sure it's balanced between literature and TV and film and video games and the different other categories. Not all U.S. science fiction, but make sure it's internationally balanced as well, and not all just props, but costumes and flat objects and books and posters and that sort of thing.
So when you think of the continuity sort of from circuses in the 1800s, the later 1800s, all the way through to Disneyland, these are exhibits that people can view and or participate in different stages. In all of those, there's little scary moments. You know, the Playland at the beach where you're going down the roller coaster, you get a little scared, but you'll later laugh at the clown exhibit. So are you visualizing, imagining that you're going to have a sort of scary episodes or moments or design features inside of it? Because I don't usually get scared when I go to the Louvre.
Well, I think so. I mean, part of it could be like a haunted house, and as you're going down the ship's corridor in say like a recreated Nostromo set from Alien, 1979, and all of a sudden something jumps out from you from the side in the dark, then you just had your roller coaster experience and you laugh and nobody gets hurt, and you just exit that corridor into another type of area where you see things related to time travel. But the interesting part is to try to weave the educational aspects into it, and try to get students to be more motivated to study the traditional STEM areas and art.
Thinking back again, second reference to my EA days, we concluded like around 1989 or 90 that we should be licensing big name properties. And that's where we started with John Madden Football. Trip had this idea about John Madden, and that's created this incredible long stream within EA Sports. And Disney started doing the same thing with licensed properties. They now own Star Wars, and they own multiple other licensed properties. Can you visualizing having licensed properties as part of and inside of the Science Fiction Museum? There's a huge following, there's established followings of Trekkies and Star Wars folks.
Well, yes and no. I mean, while a partnership with Disney on Star Wars, and I think they even own Alien and the Alien franchise now, and CBS with Star Trek, would be very advantageous. And I'm sure that we'll look at that when the time comes. But at the same time, if we're curating an exhibit that looks at space vehicles, and we have the most iconic space vehicles, both from film, TV, and literature, in an exhibit, then I'm not so sure that the same type of licensing and sponsorship needs to be in place.
What do you see as your potential for institutional funding? Can you imagine some institutions which might have an interest in the Museum of Science Fiction? National Institute of Arts, etc.?
Yes. I think museums have always been beneficiaries of institutional funding. There's a fabulous pavilion at the National Air and Space Museum, sponsored by Boeing, and there is a lot of institutional funding that came to the museum through that channel. I think when the time comes, we'll be able to look at maybe, for instance, like a technology company that's working with AI and quantum computers, and do a whole survey and exhibit on how artificial intelligence and quantum computing are creating newer technologies as they converge.
So when you look at the Museum of Modern Art and you look at who attends, who the attendees are, the people who go to the museum, and then you compare it to the Met, there's different kinds of folks that go to each of those. How would you identify who you think are the more likely attendees for the Museum of Sci-Fi?
Well, I think with the art museums, the common denominator is the people love art. And with the Museum of Science Fiction, which is genre-based, I think you're talking about the people that love all of the different aspects of science fiction, and you can cross-cut it lots of different ways. You can look at the educational aspects, people that want to take their children to really enriching type experiences, people that like a particular type of franchise, Star Wars, or people that are very into Jules Verne or H.G. Wells as authors. So it would probably appeal to lots and lots of different types of people.
And just to follow up on what Greg said, museums have traditionally had a hard time attracting a younger audience. And the interesting thing about this project is the audience is very young here. We have a lot of people in their 20s who are really interested in science fiction, and they come to our events. And so this is not a traditional museum audience. It's just a very varied demographic of people. So it's very positive seeing that.
So how can people help? If somebody was interested, if a thoughtful person who loves museums and or a sci-fi buff, or another person who's interested in helping you, how can they help you?
Well, right now on the museum's homepage, we accept donations, and they're tax deductible because the museum is a 501c3 nonprofit charitable organization. So that would be one way to help. It's pretty easy to remember. It's museumofsciencefiction.org.
So you were saying, my question is, how can people help? They can
Well,
go.
the two main things to do right now is raise awareness and raise funding. And as we move down the road with those two main initiatives, then I think we'll get to a physical place, however that may be designed, which is Jerry's side of the project, and then get it properly funded.
Thank you very much for sharing your vision of the Museum of Science Fiction, Greg Viggiano, founder of the museum, and Jerry Vanek, lead designer of the museum. It's very, very fun and inspiring, exciting to see this embryonic enterprise and listen to your vision of it. And we've enjoyed having you as guests on the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Thank you very much for joining us. And with that, the luncheon is adjourned.